The evening shift at Eddie's liquor store was winding down just like any other Tuesday. The tall man behind the counter arranged the small bottles of whiskey and vodka with careful hands that had seen more action than most. At 42, he still stood straight as a board, a habit from his years in uniform that he couldn't shake even if he wanted to. 3 years back in civilian life, and sometimes he still woke up thinking he was in the desert. 4 tours in Iraq had left their mark on him, not just the scars that crossed his forearms or the occasional distant look in his eyes when a car backfired outside the store. The real marks were deeper, invisible to most folks who came in for their evening bottles. The store was quiet tonight, just how he liked it. After years of explosions, gunfire, and shouted orders, quiet felt like a gift he never took for granted. The job at Eddie's had come through his uncle's friend. Just until you find something better, they'd said, but he wasn't looking for better. He was looking for normal, and this fit the bill just fine. Most customers were regulars who nodded their hellos and kept conversation short. Nobody here knew much about his military background, and that's exactly how he wanted it. No questions about what he'd seen or done. No uncomfortable thank yous for his service from people who couldn't possibly understand what they were thanking him for. The radio played softly in the background, some old soul tune his dad used to hum while fixing cars in their garage. He tapped his fingers lightly on the counter in rhythm, allowing himself this small pleasure as he glanced at the clock. Just 2 more hours until closing. The bell above the door chimed, breaking his rhythm. In the curved security mirror mounted in the corner, he watched a young man step inside. Baggy hoodie pulled low, hands stuffed deep in the pockets, eyes darting everywhere except at the cameras. Something about how the kid moved set off alarm bells in his head, the same instinctive warning system that had kept him alive through 4 combat tours. The cashier continued arranging bottles, but his focus had shifted entirely. His body remained casual while his mind went into assessment mode. The store was empty now except for the 2 of them. Through the mirror, he tracked the young man's movement between the aisles, noting how he picked up bottles only to put them back down without really looking at them. Finding everything okay? He called out, keeping his voice friendly and even. The young man startled slightly. "Yeah, just looking," he mumbled before disappearing behind the tall shelf of premium spirits. When the kid thought no one was watching, he adjusted something tucked into his waistband. The cashier had seen that move before, not in liquor stores, but on the streets of Fallujah. His hand drifted beneath the counter, pressing the silent alarm button Eddie had installed last year after the convenience store down the block got hit. He took a slow, deep breath, the same kind he used to take before entering a potentially hostile building. His heartbeat remained steady. This wasn't his first rodeo, not by a long shot. He mapped the store in his mind, distances, obstacles, potential cover spots. Old habits. The young man appeared at the end of aisle 3, pretending to study the labels on some cheap wine. Their eyes met briefly before the kid quickly looked away. Too quickly. The cashier recognized the look of someone about to make a very bad decision. He continued his work, movements smooth and unhurried while staying perfectly alert. The weight of his phone pressed against his thigh in his pocket, but he knew better than to reach for it now. The police would come eventually thanks to the silent alarm. His job was to keep things calm until then, or to handle whatever came next. Years of training had taught him that what happened in the next few minutes would depend on his ability to read the situation correctly. Sometimes showing fear made things worse. Sometimes showing too much confidence triggered violence. And sometimes the only thing that mattered was reaction time. As the young man finally approached the counter with a cheap bottle of vodka in hand, the cashier took one more deep breath and prepared himself for whatever was about to unfold. The young man placed the vodka bottle on the counter with his left hand. His right hand stayed hidden in his pocket. The cashier had seen this move too many times during his military days to mistake what was coming next. "Can I see some ID?" he asked calmly, following store policy even though he knew this wasn't going to be a normal sale. The air in the store seemed to thicken. Through the windows, cars passed by on the street, their headlights briefly illuminating the interior before moving on. Normal life continuing just outside, while something very different was unfolding inside these 4 walls. The young man shifted his weight from one foot to another. His eyes darted to the door, then back to the cashier, then to the camera in the corner. His face hardened suddenly, as if he'd made up his mind about something. "Don't need ID when I'm not paying," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he pulled out a small handgun from his pocket. The weapon looked cheap, probably a .22 or .25 caliber. Not much stopping power, but at this range, it wouldn't matter. The young man's hand trembled visibly as he pointed the gun at the cashier's chest. Sweat beaded on his upper lip despite the store's cooled air conditioning. The cashier didn't raise his hands. He didn't plead. He didn't even blink. He'd been here before, except the last time it was in a dusty building halfway around the world, and the person holding the gun had been even younger than this kid. "You don't want to do this," the cashier said quietly, his voice steady as a rock. "Shut up," the young man hissed, glancing nervously toward the windows. "Just give me the money." The cashier noticed everything in that moment, how the robber's finger rested too heavily on the trigger, how his stance was all wrong, how he'd made the critical mistake of standing too close to the counter. The kid had likely never fired that gun at another human being. The cashier had. The difference between them wasn't just experience, it was worlds apart. "The registers jam sometimes," the cashier said evenly, keeping his eyes locked on the young man's. "I need to press this button to open it." The gun shook more violently now. "Do it then. Hurry up." Behind the counter, out of sight, the cashier's right hand slowly moved toward the edge of the countertop, not the register. His left hand remained visible, palm flat against the surface. His breathing remained controlled. Inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 4. The same breathing technique that had kept him focused during firefights. "Look, man, I don't want trouble," the cashier said, his tone almost conversational. "There's only about 200 in the drawer anyway." "I don't care. Just give it to me." The young man's voice cracked again, higher this time. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated. The look of someone who hadn't thought this through, who was running on adrenaline and bad decisions. The cashier had seen that look before, on the faces of young men who'd been handed weapons and pushed into situations they weren't prepared for. Some of them had tried to kill him. Some had succeeded in killing his friends. But this wasn't Iraq, and this kid wasn't an enemy combatant. He was just a scared young man making the biggest mistake of his life. "The silent alarm is already triggered," the cashier said softly. "Police will be here in about 3 minutes. You can still walk away." The young man's face contorted with panic. "You're lying. Open the register now, or I swear I'll shoot." The distance between them was less than arm's length. The gun barrel was only about 2 feet from the cashier's chest. Time seemed to slow down, just like it always did in these moments. The cashier's muscles tensed imperceptibly, ready to move. He had 2 choices: wait for the police and hope the increasingly panicked robber didn't squeeze that trigger by accident, or take control of the situation the way he'd been trained to do when lives were on the line. The overhead lights reflected off the gun's metal surface as the young man's hand trembled more violently. The cashier made his decision. "Okay," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I'll open it now." And then he moved. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. The cashier's left hand shot up and outward, deflecting the gun to the side while his right hand clamped down on the young man's wrist with crushing force. The gun discharged with a sharp crack, sending a bullet into the ceiling tiles. Dust and small fragments rained down as the cashier twisted the weapon, free with a practiced move that bent the robber's fingers back just enough to break his grip without breaking bones. In one fluid motion, the cashier vaulted over the counter. His feet barely touched the ground before he had the young man pinned against the lottery ticket display. The gun clattered safely to the floor several feet away. "Don't move," the cashier said, his voice calm despite the racing of his heart. He wasn't hurting the young man, but he had him completely immobilized in a hold that would prevent any further trouble. The robber's eyes were wide with shock. "How did you?" "4 tours in Iraq," the cashier said simply. "This isn't my first rodeo, kid." The young man stopped struggling. His body went limp with the sudden realization of how badly he'd miscalculated. Tears welled up in his eyes. "They're gonna lock me up forever," he whispered. The cashier maintained his hold but adjusted it to be more comfortable for both of them. "You made a bad choice. Doesn't mean your whole life is over." Through the windows, blue and red lights began to flash. The silent alarm had done its job. The cashier could hear sirens growing louder. "I didn't want to hurt nobody," the young man said, his voice cracking. "I just needed money. My mom's behind on rent and my little brother." "Save it for the judge," the cashier cut him off, though his tone wasn't unkind. "Right now, when the police come in, you need to stay very still and do exactly what they say. No sudden movements. You understand me?" The young man nodded, tears now streaming down his face. The cashier's mind flashed back to another young man, years ago and thousands of miles away, who had made a similar mistake. That encounter had ended differently. The memory still haunted his dreams sometimes. "Listen to me," the cashier said, his voice dropping lower. "When this is over, you ask for help. There are programs for young men like you. Better choices than this." He nodded toward the gun on the floor. The police cruiser pulled up outside, lights painting the store in alternating blue and red. 2 officers approached the door, weapons drawn. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" came the shout as they entered. The cashier immediately raised his hands. "I'm the store employee. I've disarmed him. The weapon is on the floor to your right." The young man raised his hands too, trembling. One officer kept his weapon trained on them, while the other quickly retrieved the gun and secured it. "You okay, sir?" the first officer asked the cashier. "I'm fine," he replied, stepping back slowly. The police moved in to handcuff the young man, who offered no resistance. As they led him toward the door, he looked back over his shoulder at the cashier. "I'm sorry," he said, voice barely audible. The cashier nodded once, his face unreadable. One of the officers stayed behind to take the cashier's statement. "That was some move you pulled. Security camera caught the whole thing. Where'd you learn to disarm someone like that?" "Military," the cashier answered simply. The officer looked at him with new understanding. "Which branch?" "Marines. 4 tours in Iraq." A low whistle escaped the officer's lips. No wonder this kid didn't stand a chance. He pointed to the hole in the ceiling. "Bullet could have gone anywhere. You might have saved lives tonight." The cashier shrugged. He didn't feel like a hero. The weight of the moment was starting to settle in, the familiar post-adrenaline shakiness beginning at his fingertips. "Need medical attention. Your hand's bleeding," the officer noted. The cashier looked down. He hadn't even noticed the small cut across his palm, likely from when he twisted the gun away. "It's nothing," he said. The store phone rang. The cashier picked it up to hear his boss's panicked voice. "I just got the alarm notification. Are you okay? Do I need to call the police?" "Police are already here," the cashier replied calmly. "Everything's under control." After hanging up, he looked around the store. Apart from the bullet hole in the ceiling and a few knocked-over bottles, everything was intact. He began straightening the lottery ticket display that had been disturbed during the scuffle. The officer watched him with curiosity. Most people would be pretty shaken up right now. The cashier met his eyes. "This isn't the worst Tuesday I've had." For the first time that night, a small smile crossed his face. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was something. After the police finished taking statements and collecting evidence, they left the cashier alone in the store. His boss had called back to say he was on his way, but it would take at least 20 minutes to arrive from across town. The cashier looked at his watch, just past 9 p.m. The store usually closed at 10. He flipped the sign to closed anyway. No one would blame him after what happened. The quiet that settled over the store felt different now. Before, silence had been a comfort. Now it left too much room for thinking. He grabbed a broom from the back room and began sweeping up the small pieces of ceiling tile scattered across the floor. The familiar, repetitive motion helped steady his still trembling hands. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his sister, "Yuok? Heard about a robbery at your store on the police scanner." He texted back, "All good. Tell you about it tomorrow." Truth was, he wasn't sure how he felt. Taking down the robber had been pure instinct, his body moving on autopilot from years of training. But now, in the aftermath, emotions began to surface. Not fear, he'd faced far worse, but a strange kind of sadness. The young man's words kept replaying in his mind. "My mom's behind on rent, and my little brother." He thought about his own little brother, who had followed him into the military and come back different, quieter, haunted. Last he heard, his brother was sleeping on friends' couches, unable to hold down a job. The system that had trained them for war had done little to help them live in peace. The bell above the door chimed. The cashier turned, broom still in hand, to see a middle-aged police officer, not one from earlier, stepping inside. "Store's closed," the cashier said automatically. "I know," the officer replied. "Just wanted to check on you. I'm Officer Chen. I was a few blocks away when the call came in." The cashier nodded but said nothing. "That was some impressive work," Officer Chen continued, looking up at the bullet hole in the ceiling. "My partner told me you're a veteran." "That's right." "Which division?" "1st Marines." Officer Chen nodded with respect. "My cousin was with the 2nd. Did 2 tours before coming home in 2010. The cashier leaned the broom against the counter. He wasn't in the mood for war stories, but something about the officer's manner suggested he wasn't here just to chat. "Can I help you with something?" he asked directly. Officer Chen smiled slightly. "Actually, I think I might be able to help you, or rather, help that kid you took down." The cashier's interest was piqued despite himself. "How's that?" "I run a program at the community center for at-risk youth and veterans, gives them a place to belong, learn some skills." Officer Chen pulled a card from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Kids like the one who came in here tonight, they're usually just lost, looking for direction." The cashier picked up the card, turning it over in his hands. "I'm not much of a mentor." "Neither was I when I started," Officer Chen replied. "But sometimes all these kids need is someone who understands what it's like to face real danger. Puts their problems in perspective." He paused. "And sometimes the vets need it just as much as the kids." The broom slipped and clattered to the floor. The cashier bent to pick it up, using the moment to gather his thoughts. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Officer Chen nodded and headed toward the door. "That's all I ask." He paused with his hand on the handle. "By the way, that young man you disarmed? His name's Thomas, 17 years old. No prior record. His mom works 3 jobs. Dad was killed in Afghanistan when the kid was 5. The cashier's head snapped up. "What did you say?" "You heard me." Officer Chen's eyes were steady. "Small world, isn't it? Sometimes the people we're fighting and the people we're fighting for get all mixed up." With that he left, the bell chiming softly behind him. The cashier stood frozen, the weight of this information settling on his shoulders like a heavy pack. He'd never asked the names of the men he'd faced in combat. Never wanted to know who they were, what families they had waiting. It was easier that way. But this hit too close to home. He walked to the front windows and looked out at the quiet street. Across the way, a father was carrying a sleeping child into their apartment building. An ordinary moment on an ordinary night. The kind of moment he had fought to protect, even as he'd taken such moments away from others. His boss's car pulled into the parking lot, headlights sweeping across the store interior. The cashier pocketed Officer Chen's card and went to unlock the door. He would finish his shift tonight. He would come back tomorrow. But something had shifted inside him. A door opening where there had only been a wall before. Maybe it was time to build something instead of just surviving. 3 days had passed since the attempted robbery. The cashier returned to work despite his boss offering him the week off. Routine was important to him, had been ever since he left the service. Wake up at 5:30, exercise until 7, breakfast, work, home, sleep, repeat. The routine kept the noise in his head to a manageable level. The store had become something of a local attraction. People who had never stepped foot in Eddie's Liquor before now came in, bought something small, and tried to casually bring up the incident. The cashier answered their questions with as few words as possible. Yes, he had disarmed the robber. No, he hadn't been scared. Yes, he was a veteran. No, he didn't consider himself a hero. What he didn't tell them was how he'd sat in his car for an hour after his shift ended that night, staring at Officer Chen's card. He didn't mention that he'd looked up the community center program online, or that he'd driven past it twice already without going in. The bell chimed, pulling him from his thoughts. A middle-aged woman entered the store, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep, maybe both. She wore a waitress uniform under her coat, and her hands showed the roughness of someone who worked hard for little pay. The cashier nodded a greeting and continued stocking the shelf behind the counter. The woman didn't move toward the alcohol. Instead, she stood by the door as if gathering courage. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, the routine question automatic. The woman approached the counter slowly. "You're him, aren't you? The man who—" her voice faltered. "The one who caught my son the other night." The cashier straightened up. So this was the mother of the young robber, the woman who worked 3 jobs, the woman whose husband had died in Afghanistan. "Yes, ma'am," he answered simply. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it on the counter. "This is to pay for the damage to your ceiling. It's not much, but it's what I could pull together." The cashier didn't touch the envelope. "That's not necessary. Insurance covers it." "Please," she insisted. "I need to make this right somehow." Her eyes met his, and in them he saw a familiar weariness, the look of someone carrying too heavy a load for too long. "Your son mentioned you were behind on rent," he said carefully. She looked away, embarrassment crossing her face. "That doesn't excuse what he did." "No," the cashier agreed. "It doesn't, but it explains some things." He slid the envelope back toward her. "Use this for your rent, or for your younger son." Surprise flickered across her face. "How did you know about my younger boy?" The cashier shrugged. "Your older son mentioned him right before the police came." The woman sank onto the stool by the lottery counter as if her legs had suddenly given out. "I've tried so hard to keep them both on the right path. After their father died," she swallowed hard. "It hasn't been easy." "I know something about that," the cashier said quietly. "Were you in Afghanistan too?" she asked. "Iraq, 4 tours. My husband only made it through 1 tour in Afghanistan." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "IDD on a routine patrol," they said. The cashier nodded. He'd lost friends the same way. Routine patrols that turned out to be anything but routine. "What's going to happen to my son?" she asked. "I don't know," the cashier answered honestly. "But I do know someone who might be able to help." He pulled Officer Chen's card from his wallet and slid it across the counter to her. "He runs a program at the community center for kids who need guidance, and for vets too." She took the card, studying it. "Why would you help us?" "After what my son did." The cashier was quiet for a long moment. How could he explain that helping her son felt like helping his own brother? Or that maybe in some roundabout way, it felt like making amends for things he'd done in a country far from here? "Because we're all just trying to find our way home," he said finally. The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Thank you." The bell chimed again as another customer entered the store. The woman tucked the card into her pocket and stood up. "I should let you get back to work," she said. The cashier nodded. "Tell your son." He paused, searching for the right words. "Tell him mistakes don't define us. What we do after them does." As she walked toward the door, the cashier called after her. "And ma'am? I'll be at the community center Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, if you and your boys want to stop by." For the first time, a small smile crossed her tired face. "Maybe we will." After she left, the cashier helped the new customer find a bottle of wine for a dinner party. His movements were the same as always, efficient, professional. But inside, something had shifted. A decision made. Thursday at 7, a different kind of routine. A different way forward. Thursday came faster than expected. The cashier found himself standing outside the community center at 6:45 p.m., second-guessing his decision to come. The building was nothing special, just an old brick structure with basketball courts on one side and a small parking lot on the other. A faded sign announced East Side Community Center above double doors that had seen better days. He'd swapped his usual work clothes for jeans and a plain navy sweater. In his hand, he clutched a small paper bag. Inside was a book on careers in technology he'd picked up for the young man who had tried to rob him. The cashier wasn't even sure why he bought it, except that the kid had seemed smart despite his terrible decision-making. Through the glass doors, he could see people milling about inside, young men shooting pool. A couple of older veterans with their distinct military posture gathered around a coffee pot. Officer Chen talking to a teenage girl with bright blue hair. His phone buzzed. A text from his brother. "You actually going to that thing tonight?" He'd mentioned the community center program during their weekly phone call. His brother had been skeptical. "Those Save the Kids programs are just for show," he'd said. Maybe he was right. The cashier's finger hovered over the screen. He could make an excuse, go home, stick to his routine. Instead, he typed, "Already here." Then he pocketed the phone and pulled open the door. The noise hit him first, the clack of pool balls, the squeak of sneakers on the warm linoleum, the overlapping conversations. His hand instinctively tightened around the paper bag. Crowded, noisy places still make him tense, even after 3 years as a civilian. Officer Chen spotted him immediately and waved him over. "You made it." "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," the cashier admitted. "Let me show you around," Officer Chen said, guiding him through the room. "We've got different activities each night. Thursdays are career skills and mentoring. Some of the guys play basketball after." The cashier nodded, taking it all in. The center was clearly operating on a shoestring budget. Mismatched furniture, outdated computers. But there was something about the atmosphere, an energy, a sense of purpose, that felt genuine. "The kids who come here," the cashier asked quietly, "do they actually stay out of trouble?" Officer Chen shrugged. "Some do, some don't. We're not miracle workers, but we give them a place to belong, skills that might help them find jobs. Sometimes that's enough." They passed a bulletin board covered with success stories, photos of young men and women in graduation caps, work uniforms, military dress. Small victories in a neighborhood where victories often seemed in short supply. "And the vets?" the cashier asked. "They come for different reasons," Officer Chen replied. "Some need help finding jobs. Some just need to be around others who understand." He glanced sideways at the cashier. "Some find that helping these kids helps them too." The door opened behind them, and the cashier turned to see the woman from the liquor store enter. Behind her was a boy of about 12, the younger brother, he assumed. But the older son, the one who had held the gun, wasn't with them. The woman spotted him and froze briefly before approaching. "I didn't think you'd really be here," she said. "I said I would be," the cashier replied simply. The younger boy hung back, eyeing the cashier warily. Smart kid. Cautious. "Where's your older son?" the cashier asked. Sadness crossed the woman's face. "They're keeping him in juvenile detention until his hearing next week. But they let me visit yesterday." She paused. "I told him you might be here. He asked me to tell you he's sorry." Again. The cashier nodded. He looked down at the paper bag in his hand, then held it out to her. "This is for him. For when he gets out." She took it, peeking inside at the book. "Technology careers?" "He struck me as smart," the cashier said. "Just needs to use his brain for something better than planning robberies." A small smile crossed her face. That's what his teachers always said, before he started skipping school. Officer Chen appeared at their side. "Mrs. T, glad you could make it." He turned to the younger boy. "And this must be your younger son. We've got a computer coding class starting in 5 minutes if you're interested." The boy looked up at his mother. "Can I?" "Go ahead," she said. He didn't need to be told twice, rushing off toward the computer lab. "Your son's case is coming across my desk tomorrow," Officer Chan said to the woman once the boy was out of earshot. "The DA owes me a favor. I'm going to recommend diversion, community service instead of detention, probably right here at the center." Hope flickered across the woman's face. "Really?" Officer Chen nodded. "First offense. And having someone like him vouching for your son helps." He gestured toward the cashier. "The victim recommending leniency carries weight." The cashier hadn't known that was even a possibility. "What would I need to do?" "Write a statement. Come to the hearing if you can." The woman looked at the cashier, her eyes asking a question she couldn't put into words. Would he? Would he help the son who had threatened his life? Before he could respond, a sharp laugh from across the room caught his attention. A group of veterans were sharing stories near the coffee pot. One of them noticed him looking and raised his mug in greeting. "You should join them," Officer Chen said. The cashier hesitated. It had been a long time since he'd sat around swapping stories with other vets. A long time since he'd allowed himself to be part of something bigger than his own carefully constructed routine. "I will," he said. "But first, tell me more about this statement for the hearing, and what the kid would be doing for community service." As Officer Chen explained the process, the cashier felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the weight of making a difference. Not by taking a life or protecting a convoy, but by choosing mercy over justice, by building something instead of just surviving. 2 months had passed since that first night at the community center. The cashier now spent every Thursday evening there, sometimes helping with the career workshops, sometimes just talking with the veterans who gathered in the back room. He'd started bringing his brother along too. At first, his brother had come reluctantly, but now he was helping teach a basic car repair class on Tuesday nights. Today was different though. Today was the young robber's first day of community service. The cashier arrived early, helping Officer Chen set up chairs for the evening workshop. His hands were steady now when he came to the center. The noise didn't bother him as much. Familiar faces greeted him as he worked. Nervous about seeing him? Officer Chen asked, setting down a stack of papers. The cashier considered the question. A little, he admitted. Haven't seen him since that night. The hearing had gone well. The judge had agreed to the diversion program, 200 hours of community service plus counseling instead of juvenile detention. The cashier's statement had made a difference. He'd written about second chances and wasted potential, about how war had taught him that people could change, for better or worse, depending on the paths available to them. His mom says he's been different since getting out, Officer Chen said, quieter, thinking more. The cashier nodded. He understood that kind of transformation. Coming face to face with the consequences of your actions had a way of changing your perspective. The front door opened, and there he was. The young man who had pointed a gun at the cashier's chest. He looked smaller somehow, without the bravado and desperation of that night. He wore a plain white t-shirt and jeans that seemed a size too big. His mother stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. The room didn't fall silent, but there was a subtle shift as people noticed them. The cashier set down his stack of chairs and walked over. "Good to see you," he said simply. The young man couldn't quite meet his eyes. "Yeah, you too." His voice was barely audible. "Your mom tells me you started back at school," the cashier said. A nod. "Got some catching up to do. That technology book help at all?" The young man looked up, surprised. "Yeah, actually, I've been reading about app development." His mother squeezed his shoulder gently. "He's always been good with computers, just never had the right." She searched for the word. Direction, the cashier finished for her. Officer Chen joined them, clipboard in hand. "Ready to get started? We've got you helping with the computer lab cleanup and setup today." The young man nodded, seeming almost relieved to have something to do. As Officer Chen led him away, the cashier turned to the mother. "How are things at home?" "Better," she said. "The rent assistance program you told me about came through, and my younger boy is doing well in that coding class." She paused. "We're going to be okay, I think." From across the room came the sound of laughter. The cashier's brother was showing another veteran something on his phone, both of them grinning widely. 2 months ago, his brother had barely smiled at all. "Your brother seems different," the mother observed. "He is," the cashier agreed. "We both are." She studied his face. "You know, I used to be so angry after my husband died. At the war, at the government, at everyone. I blamed the military for taking him away." She glanced toward where her son was setting up computers. "Then I almost lost my boy too. But instead, a military man saved him." She shook her head. "Life's strange that way." The cashier thought about all the twists his own life had taken. The tours in Iraq that had broken something inside him. The liquor store job he'd taken just to have somewhere quiet to go each day. The gun pointed at his chest that should have been terrifying, but instead had woken something up inside him. "Your son asked me something last week," the mother said. "He wanted to know why you didn't shoot him when you had the chance. He said most people would have." The cashier watched as the young man carefully wiped down computer screens, focusing intently on his task. "What did you tell him?" he asked. "I told him I didn't know," she replied. "That he should ask you himself." Later that evening, after the workshops ended and people began to filter out, the young man approached the cashier as he was stacking chairs. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was stronger now, more certain. The cashier nodded. "Why did you help me? After what I did?" The cashier set down the chair he was holding. It was a question he'd asked himself many times over the past 2 months. "Because I've seen enough destruction," he said finally. In Iraq, I had to make split-second decisions about who was a threat and who wasn't. Sometimes I got it wrong. He looked directly at the young man. That night in the store, I saw someone who made a terrible choice, not someone who was terrible. There's a difference. The young man absorbed this. My dad died in Afghanistan when I was little. I don't remember him much. I know, the cashier said. Mom says he was a hero. I'm sure he was. The young man picked up a chair, helping with the stacking. I want to do something that would make him proud. Not, he trailed off. Not robbery. The cashier finished, a slight smile crossing his face. The young man actually laughed, a quick, surprised sound. Yeah, not that. As they finished cleaning up, the cashier noticed Officer Chen watching them from across the room, a satisfied expression on his face. The officer raised his coffee mug in a small salute. Outside, as they prepared to leave, the cashier's brother was deep in conversation with the mother about a possible job opening at his new workplace. The younger brother showed off a simple game he coded in the computer class. The cashier stood slightly apart, watching them all. His life had been defined by war for so long, by what he'd done and seen in Iraq, by the walls he'd built around himself after coming home. Now those walls were coming down, brick by brick. Not in some dramatic fashion, but slowly, through quiet Thursday evenings and small acts of forgiveness, both for others and for himself. Same time next week? The young man asked as they parted ways. The cashier nodded. I'll be here. And for the first time in years, he was looking forward to it.